Under information, title funding for parent engagement strategy. What do we?
You just had that report that you had asked for. It was in your packet.
Correct. You got for us.
Right.
Correct. Yes, we
Right.
did. Everybody see that? It's about the funding for that it's okay? Okay. Under discussion, continuation of the FEMA grant process.
Yes, yes.
Mr. Vice President, members of the board, you should have, Diana, I think, shared with you some talking points for the FEMA grant. It's in memo form. Just wanted to catch the board up with the process. We did submit a formal FEMA grant for a safe room in February of 2012. That's for 75% federal funds and 25% local match for the cost of the safe room itself. At that time, the project was for the choir and the band rooms as part of the new addition under the bond issue at the high school. We were notified a couple of weeks ago by FEMA. Actually, SEMA is the state emergency management folks are the first gatekeepers in this process, asking us if we wanted to continue with this process. We are in the grant funding cycle. I think you'll note that we would still be responsible for 25% of a project, and we have a couple of options, one of which is that we can change our location and move it to the Early Childhood Center, which would be on the Truman campus. That was one of our considerations when we first looked at the safe room, because that would serve numerous schools in that area as well. So if we do continue in that grant cycle, there are a couple of things that the board would have to consider. One is, where do we get the 25% match? And we've listed several options for you. There's always the possibility of a bond issue, whether or not we would be interested in doing some kind of a lease for that additional 25%, and then whether or not we would want to change that location to the Early Childhood Center. What we hear from the grant group that has worked with us is that once FEMA approves this cycle of grants, which happens to have Joplin, Missouri in it, so we think it will be very, very laborious and a fairly robust cycle, that it's anywhere from 3 to 30 months before grant funding comes down to any individual project. And that's the time that you need to have the match money and be ready. The other consideration for the board is that we would need to post for a project management engineering firm, as well as for the architectural firm that would be producing the design plans for the safe room, because that would allow us to recoup those costs. You must have them on your staff prior to the time that you start the funding cycle and finalize the grant, so then you can recoup 75% of your design costs as well. So the point of consideration for the board currently is whether or not we wish to stay in that funding cycle, which would be 75% federally funded and 25% locally. And at the point that we receive the grant, we could make the decision as to the location, whether or not it would be early childhood or at that time where we stand as far as other projects are concerned. Do you have questions that I might be able to answer?
Ms. Sarah, you made a comment that if we were, once we accept this grant, we could change location.
Yes. Actually, what the engineering firm we work with right now is Toth and Associates out of Springfield, and they have done about 95% of all safe rooms for school districts. It is not a problem to change your location. What you have to do at that point is resubmit the specs for that building. So we have to do a demographic area that shows us the population that we would serve, and then we resubmit at that point, which does lengthen the process a little bit, but you can change locations. You can also ask for a separate grant if there's still money available. The difficulty for us is if we give up our spot right now, since we're in the funding cycle, that we would be, we wouldn't have that money available, and we possibly would not be able to get into another funding cycle. But yes, we can change the location. You can change the size of your project. Whether or not they have money to allow you to go up
That was my question.
is questionable.
How would that affect of their contribution to that
Right
project?
now, what we were proposing was about $1.7 million for the 75% if it were on the high school campus. And the way we arrived at that was the number of people it would serve. And we looked at only our high school population, our teachers, our support staff, and then volunteers and parents who might be on campus at any given time. That's how we determined the size of that safe room. And if you consider even going to the early childhood location, we would be serving Truman Kindergarten, which is about 340 students, their staff members, Washington Franklin, their staff members, and then also it would be W.L. Johns, since they would be on that location as well. So that would be our proposed population, which is pretty close to where we are with our high school. You can also draw a circle and go up to a 5-minute walk and invite local folks into your safe room as well. If you do that, you do have to staff it every month of the year and have to have availability 24 hours a day. If you're just serving your school population, you're only responsible for staffing during the time you have students and staff members on that campus or those neighboring campuses. Are there other questions that I might answer?
And this, I have another question.
Sure.
This grant applies whether it's a freestanding building, an addition, an add-on, has no effect.
That's correct. All we have to do is meet their specifications as to how we build the building. Lots of districts choose to add a gymnasium space because that's, if it's smaller than what our high school proposed gymnasium was, it's pretty doable under those safety guidelines. One of the pieces, if we did move to the early childhood building, you'd probably be talking about that common space as well as hallways and then possibly only a couple of the classrooms that you would choose to build to those specifications rather than all of the classrooms. So there could be additional costs to finalize that building that wouldn't be a part of that 75%, 25% match, since that is simply for the structures that are built to the specifications of the safe room.
And also knowing that the building of the safe room considerably drives up the cost of the project.
Exactly.
I had a conversation at graduation, matter of fact,
Okay.
with Paul Brockmiller, who's involved in one at Fredericktown, and they, of course, haven't done the safe room because they haven't been allocated the money. But he said if it's a $2 million job, it'll be $3 million because of all the extra thickness of concrete,
Exactly.
structural steel, and all that stuff.
You're guaranteeing a room that will withstand a tornado, which is
Correct.
certainly different building specifications than an average building. Yes, that is correct.
Sarah, what did you say that the cost estimate was at the high school?
At the time that we were proposing the high school, it would have served that population, and the 75% that the federal government, that we wrote into the grant, was about $1.7 million,
1.7, okay.
which would be kind of the amount of money they're holding in, so to speak, the Farmington pot right now
Right.
in that grant cycle. And they will either allow you to downsize or upsize depending on if you change your location. But if you change your location and there's not any more money in that grant cycle, they're not going to give you more money than they have.
Okay.
Right.
But your feeling is we can use the 1.7 million at the Early Childhood Development Center?
Those were the two buildings that we considered when we first approached this whole process. Dolores was in that when we initially just began to talk about that. Those are both high-needs areas, and you just have to look at the design of the building and which portions of the building can be done without, as Mr. Hain was saying, driving your cost up too much. You still need to get the building you want. You know, it has to serve your purposes even if someone's giving you money. It has to really fit into your mission and what your purpose is for your students.
Thank you.
Sarah, if we
Yes.
opt out of this at this time, then what happens?
We write a formal letter to SEMA saying, please remove our grant from this process. This cycle will probably go through in around, supposed to go in July. They're not, the federal government's not real nitpicky as to timeframes. Sometimes they don't hold on to those. And then there would be up to that almost 3 years before all these grants would kind of move out to individual schools. There will be another funding cycle. It just depends on when their money's available. This isn't one of those that February of every year they guarantee X number of grants. It kind of depends on what's being released by the legislature as far as funding's concerned and how many people are asking for these funds. I wouldn't say that we would never have the opportunity again. We totally might have the opportunity again. We would just have to watch for another grant funding cycle. They're not known to look fondly at people that turn down their money and then ask for it at a different date. I think that happened to Cape Girardeau in the past. And their concern was the cost of changing their dollar amount for what they wanted to build. Right. Okay. Thank you.
Any other questions? If not, we'll move on to options to address urgent transportation facility and technology needs.
I provided a 2-page outline for you to kind of just walk through this real quickly. The options, I think, are pretty straightforward with respect to each of our areas of need. The first part involves the matching portion of the FEMA grant, the Early Childhood Center proposed project. And some of this is review, but as you can see, by going forward with that grant and identifying that project for FEMA, we would have some options of how to provide that funding. One, obviously, would be through a bond issue, which, you know, if it's out there in the future, that project could definitely be placed in there, and those proceeds could be used to provide those additional funds. A lease purchase could be done with respect to that project. And let me remind you that lease payments do come out of operating funds, so it is a budgetary concern for us. And I've just estimated that I believe on a 10-year lease, using some of the interest rates that Mr. Hart had previously, keep in mind this is just an estimate, to provide project funds of $1 million to pair with that FEMA grant, you would probably be looking at a yearly payment somewhere in the neighborhood of $116,000. And keep in mind that a lease purchase of that nature would not require voter approval, would require Board of Education approval, obviously. But in some ways, it's very similar to a bond issue. Obviously, one other method to go forward with that grant would be just to take the money out of our fund balances, our operating funds. We believe the additional cost on top of the FEMA grant to fund that early childhood project could be $800,000 to $1 million. So you can see that's pretty significant. We may not want to do that. It may not be prudent to do that in a time of declining fund balances. So I think that would be the big concern there. But as Sarah mentioned, I think the thing that we've looked at on that, we just don't know about the timing, the range of timing that she's been given. I mean, we could be, it could be months, maybe even, more than a year, year and a half, or maybe even 2 years before we would really have to have the funding in place. Obviously, in my opinion, the bond issue would be the best way to have that project included in something, in a successful bond issue prior to that point. But if that didn't happen and the grant did begin and the board was committed to that project, then the board, by a majority vote, could implement a lease option. One other thing to consider is that lease, if done at the time to make the grant go forward, that lease could be paid off by a future bond issue after that. So those are three options with respect to the grant.
I think that was actually, we paid off part of the lease back in 2006.
Yes, in 2006, the bond issue, we did have an old facilities lease of, it was $2.5 million, somewhere in that range, that was paid off through the bond issue.
There's no penalty for paying off a lease purchase.
Well, I think you have to, as Mr. Hart says, and I think that's what we desire, you have those call features put in a lease just the same way you would a bond, where, and he even informed me the other day, you can actually put a 1-year call, a 2-year call, to basically where there's no penalty. And you can make it flexible to where you can pay that off basically anytime you want, if structured properly, and that can definitely be done. Shift gears and going to transportation. I think we're really talking about school buses and equipment. My examples primarily refer to school buses. Here at Farmington, we do have a little bit of precedent for this. Back when I first started, back in the mid to late 90s, it was kind of a common practice for us to enter into school bus leases as a way of kind of being budget friendly. And so I kind of drew upon my experience there. We generally used to lease maybe 4 buses on a 4 or 5 year lease, very short term. And keep in mind, these numbers are totally made up by me, except for the 90,000, which Mrs. Williams tells me is about the cost of a bus right now. So I just wanted to illustrate that, for instance, on a lease purchase for school buses, once again, it does come out of operating money. I used an example of 3.5% in a 4-year lease. So if we were committed to spending 90,000 for bus payments each year, we could actually obtain 4 buses up front on a yearly payment of 90,000 and an additional one-time down payment of 30,000. That's just to illustrate to you. Now, my next example, direct purchase, or as opposed to a lease payment of 90,000 a year over a 4-year period, we could say, well, we're going to commit 90,000 to the budget, but we don't want to enter a lease. Well, basically, obviously, all you could do there is buy 1 bus.
And I know our last meeting, we talked a little bit about the buses and safety, and I think our maintenance and people do a fantastic job with the safety ratings of those buses. And I think one of the other things to consider, with the age of some of the buses and the new buses and the increased safety that they have on those, and again, Stacy would know more than I would, but with those newer buses, there are more safety put into those, and you're also looking at a fuel savings with the new buses as well. So those are just all factors to consider, when looking at this option.
Yeah, and I mean, even though you're making the budget commitment for a 4-year period, for instance, as opposed to a 1-year, and let's review that every year, it enables you to do a couple of things. You can get those 4 buses, you can upgrade your fleet immediately, you can reduce some maintenance costs there, and I think you can also lock in the current price, because I don't recall school price, the buses, price of school buses, I don't recall ever going down. I can remember when it was 55,000, now it's 90. So you can kind of lock that in at current price. So those are some possibilities there. Moving on to facilities, which would include renovations and major repairs. It does not have to mean new construction. You obviously have the capability of doing that through a bond issue. You can do a lease purchase for facilities, which is similar to the lease I talked about earlier. But keep in mind, once again, that those lease payments come from our operating budget, not debt service funds. So you're affecting budgetary concerns. And these are numbers that basically I just gave you for an example. These came from Mr. Hart's workbook that he provided the board on May 1st. Just to give you some examples, if you went 10-year leases, 4 major renovations and repairs, if you commit $186,000 each year to out of the budget, you could do a project of $1.6 million, and so on. $289,000, you could do a $2.5 million project, and so on. I think the potential there is obvious, and once again, that does not require voter approval. It requires a majority of the board. Once again, those are the types of things that can be paid off subsequently through bond issue proceeds, which is what we did with the 06 bonds. We paid off an old facilities lease. And so I think once again, you're looking at doing more work currently for what I consider to be the same operating budget allocation, or you can just make that, for instance, I just pulled the middle one. If we say, okay, let's allocate $289,000 to the budget this year, we're not going to do a lease, well, obviously that's all the work you can do. So that's just something to consider there. One more, Chad's back there to help me, because I'm not really familiar that much with technology leasing. I know just some basic lease things, but once again, and bond issue proceeds, and you all know that was included in our previous issue. And the same thing with technology and transportation. We got a lot of questions about, well, why would you buy those types of assets with 20-year term bonds and things like that? Well, that can be addressed, and it was, because we said that we would structure the bonds to have some shorter maturities that would equate to those assets. And my preference for using bond issues at this time and in this day and age is that the state's not funding us at 100%, and that's one way you can do this without affecting your operating budget. If times are good and we have 100% funding from the state, we may not be talking about bond issue proceeds for transportation and technology. But in this day and time, I think it makes sense to at least take a look at it.
Well, and I think, 2007, 2008, I think at the end of the year, when Dr. Sanders was here, we ended up buying 2 buses at the end of that fiscal year, Don. So, I mean, that was when we were getting fully funded. We're close to fully funded. And again, that's just not the reality now.
You have more flexibility then, and I think you could look at the year end and say, we can do this, we can do 1 or 2 things like that, and maybe stay ahead of the curve a little bit. I don't think we have that flexibility right now. And to be honest with you, even if we finish in the black this year somewhat, with 17% fund balance, I don't know if we want to commit those fund balances. I mean, I don't consider 17% really to be enough of a safety net for me. Of course, the board gets to decide that. So anyway, with respect to technology, you basically have some other options. You can basically lease purchase, which is basically a financing lease. It's just like, the district would buy technological equipment, we would own it, and we would maintain it. It's basically like a loan. There is something else for technology which could be considered because it lends itself to this, would be an operating lease. In other words, we would pay to use the equipment for a specified time period. We're not going to own it, and we're not going to have full responsibility for maintaining it. We're basically renting it. We're basically using it, and it could be cycled out on a more regular basis or a replacement cycle.
Typically 3, 4, 5 years.
Right. Obviously the advantages to that, we're not buying it, we're not owning it, so that after its sunset days or whatever, and the equipment starts to fade, we have the responsibility then once again to replace that. On this kind of continuous situation, and Chad, correct me if I'm wrong, I would assume we would be bringing in new up-to-date equipment on a regular basis.
That's correct, based on the term of your lease.
Right, and the disadvantage to that is you have continuous payments. We'd be paying for that, and I'm assuming that payment would include the use of the equipment and their maintenance costs and whatever. But it is a way to stay current.
Is that pretty expensive? It's based per piece of equipment, a certain dollar amount per month. It is not cheap. I've seen the range anywhere from, on a desktop PC, from $10 a PC up to $18, $20 a PC per month. So when you add that up, you end up with some pretty sizable payments. But when you do the numbers and the math on it, it makes life cycle on equipment make a lot more sense to do it that way. We're responsible for the entire operation of the equipment, but as far as anything related to hardware or malfunction of the equipment, the manufacturer, which is actually the one that the lease is structured through, takes care of supporting, replacing, and even working on the hardware itself.
The way the technology looks, we're never really going to own it anyway, because by the time we get it paid for,
It changes so fast.
Right.
Yeah. It's very difficult to maintain a life cycle when you're buying.
Chad,
in a 4 or 5 year cycle, just leasing it end up being the same cost as owning it.
what's your critical need cost?
I'm sorry, no.
Your critical need cost for technology? I mean, it's not in here,
The critical budget number, 168.
168,000.
168,000 was the critical number. Yeah, and that did include some PCs in that, with 130 included in the street. It may be a touch higher, leasing one, if you run the math, but the ability to maintain it, to have it standardized, everything's the same, the types of equipment, and the fact that you can maintain the rotation cycle, in my opinion, makes it a strong option.
Will that apply to your network equipment also, or just your classroom stuff?
It's really just classroom stuff. You can lease infrastructure equipment, but I can tell you from experience that doesn't seem to make mathematical sense. It seems that costs much more on lease.
So Chad, this network security system that's in here, is that part of the security system for the schools and that?
It's not related to building security. It's filtering antivirus, content protection for internet traffic.
Okay.
And these aren't all, it isn't necessarily all or nothing. I think within technology, there's definitely some equipment that would lend itself to that kind of a lease, whereas other equipment may not, that we may want to own for various reasons.
Right, and some of it does make financial sense to own. Bear in mind too, that we do have some PCs in this district that are relatively new. Obviously, we don't want to just forklift everything in lieu of a lease. We would want to phase it in over a period of time to allow the newer equipment to begin its decline and implement it that way. That would be the most beneficial in my opinion.
Chad, just a little math, it looks to me like the leasing, if it was $18 a unit, I don't know, it's not really fair. Well, your PCs in your projection had them in there at $2,000 for your 130 units that you were going to buy?
I don't think so.
It shouldn't have been.
I gave him $500. I checked.
That was only one section of that 100.
Was that just one?
That was just one.
They looked high to what I was expecting to see.
Yeah, the 130 machines, I was allowing roughly $500 for a machine or laptop.
Okay. Maybe I just...
Yeah, we buy off the WISCA contract, which is the Western States Contract Alliance, and it's a deal specifically for education that gives us very aggressive pricing on laptops.
And also with technology, and once again, this is not an all or nothing. Perhaps with the use of other methods, we could consider also direct purchase of some things, just depending on what that might be. And of course, Chad would be advising us on that. So really, just to summarize, and you can see a common theme through all of these, I believe all of these could be funded with bond issue proceeds, and as I mentioned before, it's for some might not be ideal in the past, but I think now it makes sense to at least consider it. As you know, bond issues do require voter approval. The projects are paid for with the proceeds of the bonds, and the bond payments are paid out of debt service funds, which are derived directly from that tax levy. So it does not affect your operating budget. It is not touching personnel money. It's not touching supply money.
Activity.
Cafeteria, for that reason alone, I think it merits consideration. All of these other options, whether it be the lease purchase where you're actually financing equipment or facilities, whether you're basically paying an operating lease to use equipment, or obviously whether you're making direct purchase, those all affect operating money. So that's all got to be a budgetary consideration, and it's got to be twofold. I think, we can say, okay, let's do leases for everything. We still have to pay attention to how much we're committing, because that payment becomes a budget item. That lease payment there's going to be a schedule, depending on the term, depending on the interest rate, depending on what we're buying, that's going to require a yearly payment of principal and interest. So that's going to be a consideration. Obviously, how much we take out of the budget every year has to be a consideration, especially with our fund balances. I think we're okay. I mean, 17% is okay. There's a lot of schools in worse shape than we are. But I don't think we have sufficient fund balances to make large-scale draws against our fund balance for some major things. I just don't think we can do that right now. I don't think it's a prudent thing to do.
So where are you at right now? So you're looking at, let's say, the FEMA situation, that we'd put that in the closet for right now.
Okay.
And if you just look at your buses, and if you did a lease purchase for $330,000, that's $90,000. If you did the basic first step there, that Mr. Hart had given us that information, $186,000, basically you're up to $276,000.
Yes, sir.
Okay. And if you did something with technology where you did $170,000 or whatever, and you did it on payments of $30,000, you're up to $300,000. So if you did that for minimum to take care of critical needs, your $300,000 is going to come out of the general fund.
Yeah,
Where's that going to come from?
Yeah, and right now, as I've always done, we always have provided an amount in the operation and maintenance budget, which is sort of I call it major repair type situation. In the past, now that number this year is $150,000 in the budget. In the past, it was more. $200,000, $250,000. A lot of time, and in essence, that is a contingency for anything that has to be fixed. I don't think it's a sufficient contingency, but at least we always try to place something in the budget to at least give us a head start on some things that might come up. In years past, as you know, Howard, there were things that we could identify that we knew we were going to have to do, and that might affect that budget. So, and those are, I would consider those are emergency needs, the things that we would fix on an emergency basis. So that provision of 150 is there.
Right, but in the past, there's things come up in 365 days that Jim Owen is not going to predict.
Absolutely.
Or that,
Absolutely.
the head custodian of the buildings aren't going to predict.
Absolutely.
So I think maybe some of that money is feasible, but you're going to need some of that.
Yeah, and absolutely. And regardless of whether I have 200,000 or 150,000 or zero in there, in reality, there are things in the district that if they break, we're going to fix.
Right.
So that, but I'm just telling you that provision is there. I don't believe all that has been expended this year, but that kind of gives you a reference point. But I think and it is important, I think what Howard is saying, I mean, whether you provide a provision to buy certain things in certain amount on a one-year basis, or whether you commit to leases or any combination thereof, you're definitely affecting your operating budget. Any questions?
Thank you. And now we're ready to go over some action items. Under the first action item, approval of scheduling the regular June board meeting for Wednesday, June 27, 2012 at 5 p.m. And we had some discussion on this before about making one meeting rather than having a regular meeting and then having closing out the books for Don towards the end of the year.
And that's the second one that's there.
Right.
I make a motion that we have one meeting
Okay.
on June 27th.
I have a motion, we have that one meeting on June 27th. Is there a second?
Second.
There's a couple seconds, good. Get them? Any other discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Item B, approval to authorize June bills to be paid at the regular time to aid in closing out the 2012-2013 school year.
I so move.
Second.
Any other discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Approval of the administration's recommendation for lawn mowing equipment. We have that before us. That's all that. Horsepower?
So moved.
Just,
Quickly.
yeah, I was just asking.
No,
Questions?
this is a different
Yeah.
mower that was bid
Right,
out.
right, right. Just, that's okay. You can get with me later.
I'm thinking this is a 30.
Okay, okay. I was just curious.
What brand is it?
Kubota.
Made in Gainesville, Georgia.
Is there a reason why you wanted to go to the 60-inch deck instead of the 72s?
With 60-inch deck, we can keep to the rear discharge, or rear bike. It also gives us an option to use a smaller trailer when we move it.
I think Ben made the motion.
Sorry. I thought he said horsepower was good.
Yeah.
You made, did you make
made a
a motion?
Motion to
Cool.
approve.
I'm sorry. We have a motion. Is there a second?
David.
Big Ben made it and Little Ben did it. Second, yeah. Any other discussion? All those in favor of purchasing the mower, raise your hand. Opposed? Item D, approval for the administration to develop a lease plan option to meet urgent transportation needs.
Do we need a motion for I ask a question about this?
You can ask a question, go ahead.
Yes, need a motion first.
In a second.
Make a motion to approve lease option, urgent transportation needs.
Is there a second?
Second.
A second. All right, now discussion.
My question would be, last time we met, last Tuesday, we discussed cameras, we discussed purchase of buses, we discussed automatic gates, base radios, and today we talked about purchasing of buses. My question would be, is what we talked about today what we're looking at in a lease purchase agreement?
It's all of those transportation needs. We would come back, if we have your permission, with a proposal to meet those transportation needs. It could include buses, the gate, and the camera equipment. We're using the word transportation
So
to summarize that.
we're not finalizing what we're going to lease purchase, amount, anything?
We're just going to develop a plan if you give us the permission to move forward.
And I would assume that's on all the next
Yes.
action items.
Right. You're not approving the plan, but we didn't even want to get... Any other questions?
I guess I have a question. I have a comment, I guess. I know that there's a need in transportation to upgrade things. But I also know that we went to the voters here and asked for a bond issue and were denied those funds. But then we're going to take a look here at going ahead and spending money for some of those items that we would have done anyway by approval of the board. And in doing so, then I know that teachers, what were the raises this last year for teachers?
Well, teachers got steps on it.
Yeah, step only. There was no raise. I mean, and it's not like those fund balances are going to be dipped into even more. Anyway. Any other discussion?
I thought, when we had our meeting last Thursday, I thought we was going to discuss each part of these critical needs that we thought that we need to be looking at. And that.
No, what we want to do is get your permission to develop the plan, and then we would come back. We kind of need to know what all of the costs are going to be. We may well come back if you approve the transportation plan, and all that may end up being on there is the gate and the cameras. But until we know which things we can look at a lease, which things we may have to pay for out of general operating, we don't know how to plan.
Well, that's the reason
So
why
the next step, we would bring the plans back, and then we would know all of the pieces that we have, and that would be where the individual items would be. We would price that out, and that's when we would look at those.
That's the reason why I thought maybe we was going to ask each one of us what we thought would need to be in that. I mean, you guys are putting in what you want in that. Then you're going to come back and then asking us.
Well,
and then
part
what we
of the
think.
reason, and we will do that, we'll ask you what you think, but the issue is that if we don't know the breadth of what we have to figure money on, then we can do all the planning in the world, but we need to know all the areas that were there. So we're not eliminating your ability to give input. But at this point, we don't know, for example, if you're going to be asking us to take $165,000 to buy technology out of operating funds. So we can't start to plan and look at those things until we know which areas you're saying don't do anything with, those areas that you can look at some leasing options with, or those areas that have to come out of our general operating fund. As we're trying to move forward to put that together, we need to have that direction. You will still be able to have a list and strike those. We will not enter into a lease. But until we have a general sense of what the whole package can look like, it's very difficult for us to move forward with that. So you're not losing your opportunity to do that. But it really does depend on what happens with each of these, how much we have to look at for leasing and what options we really have available.
As you have this worded, approval of administration to develop a lease plan option.
Yes.
I do not see where this ties the board to
No.
approving a lease.
It does not. But it does not have us moving ahead when you absolutely aren't willing to look at a lease. We would bring each of the plans back for the needs and the whole package.
But we're tied into nothing.
Pardon me?
We're not tied into anything.
No.
Yeah, right, I
No.
agree, I understand
Line
that.
item,
Just make sure everybody
nothing,
else
but-
understands that.
So if we don't like the lease option, when we look at it, then.
If you don't like the items in there, we can,
What the wording is that you're allowing administration to develop lease options, okay? We're not approving a lease purchase.
correct.
No, I understand that. I'm just saying, you know,
Okay.
I know you and Ben described about, you know, not purchasing buses, and that's the way I'm leaning. So why are we keep on bringing these buses in here if we know that the board is not interested in buying buses, you know?
Well, I'm assuming that's just an example of the lease purchase and the amounts, I believe.
Yeah.
What that is what you...
But that's gonna change, if you're not figuring buses in there, that's gonna be changing
Jeff,
your
if you-
figures
If
and
you remember
everything.
when Don said he put those figures together because he was familiar with the lease we had with buses, he knew what that amount was.
Yeah.
I don't think they intended that.
Yeah.
Okay. Any other discussion? If not, all those in favor of the administration developing lease plan options, please raise your hand.
For transportation.
For transportation, item D. Okay. Those opposed? Okay. Being 3-3 is not a majority. Okay, item E, approval for administration to develop a lease plan option to meet urgent facility needs.
So moved.
There's a motion by Mr. Roethlisberger.
Second.
A second. By Mr. Harrington. Any discussion? Being no discussion, all those in favor of allowing administration to develop a lease plan option, please raise your hand. For facilities.
It is.
Okay. Those opposed? Item F, approval of administration to develop a lease plan options to meet urgent technology needs.
So moved.
Mr. Roethlisberger with a motion,
Second.
Mr. Harrington with a second. Any discussion? No discussion. All those in favor of approval of administration for the lease option for technology, raise your hand. Those opposed? Okay. Having finished all business,
Nope, we got one more.
I'm sorry, we are on G, I apologize. Approval to continue with the FEMA grant process, including posting with engineering and architectural firm to comply with requirements.
So moved.
There's a motion
Second.
and a second. Any discussion? If there's no discussion, all those in favor of moving forward, raise your hand. Those opposed?
What was it?
I would entertain a motion to enter into closed session. You're going to have to go there.
So moved.
There you go.
Or do I have to
Mr.
read
Davis.
it?
Yeah, we have to read it.
Personnel pursuant to 610.021, including sections 1, 3, and 13.
Second?
Second by Mr. Harrington.
Just give me just point at me, I'll
Roll
second.
call vote, I'm sorry. I'm just trying to move things
No, that's
along.
okay, that's all right.
Farmington.
Yes.
Howard.
Yes.
Davis.
Yes.
Harrington.
Yes.
Lawson.
Yes.
Roethlisberger.
Yes.
Want this session?
Yes. We are in closed session. Thanks for coming, folks.